画魂潘玉良的一生，值得后人细细追念。
It was kind of like the days of, I guess, in fashion Dior, you know. I will tell them what length the ladies' skirts should be, okay, and they will wear them. Well, I will tell them what they're going to want in their car, and they will like it.
What did your father think when your face was there on the cover of Time magazine?
For parents, it's probably the greatest thing since sliced bread.
Shirley Young is a marketing superstar who knows what the consumer wants. As a young researcher working at Gray Advertising, Young pioneered something called attitudinal studies. The new technique went beyond simple demographics to look at the psychology of consumers. It was the birth of the now familiar focus group research. Young was then hired by General Motors to help put the troubled giant back in touch with its markets. She now divides her time between New York and Shanghai, where she led GM's successful effort to become the Chinese government's American partner in developing an auto industry for the world's biggest market. It's been quite a personal journey from the country of her birth and back again.
My first memories was being in France, which is where my younger sister was born. And it was 1938, 39, I guess. Everybody was worried about war. And I remember hearing all these conversations about war. And
your father was posted there?
He was posted there, yes. Then we went to the Philippines. And my father was posted there because he was the consul general. When the Japanese came in, and they were all arrested. And then they were all subsequently executed.
Your father among them?
My father and the entire consulate. There were 7 of them. I remember we were sitting at breakfast, or late breakfast, and we had seen the Japanese soldiers come in, and they wore these, they had those kind of bandages around their legs, which to me was very fascinating. They had these, you know, and the floors were marble, so they walked and click, 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 you know. And I guess my father was expecting it. So he went into the bedroom, got his suitcase, and he left. And then he went to prison.
Your life had to change so dramatically from living the privileged life of
yes.
a consul general of China
yes.
in Manila
yes.
with what, servants and
of course,
gardens,
yes, yes,
gardens.
absolutely, right.
And then suddenly what happened?
All the women and children of the 7 consuls had no place to go because all the husbands were taken. They had no salaries left. So they all moved into our house. We had a bungalow of you know, just a nice family home with 3 bedrooms. And we had 40 people there as a result of this. So that's how I grew up. And it went from this very nice suburban place with beautiful gardens and flowers. And, of course, the first thing that went was there was no more gasoline. So we had no more cars. So we went to horse carts. And then pretty soon the water supply was cut so that we went to wells. And then then there was no more electricity, of course. And so we went to candles and kerosene. And we just went back. And then the garden became a farm. We had chickens and ducks and pigs and all that. We used to make our own soy sauce. We had to take the husks off to our own rice. And we made our own shoes, and we did everything.
You had to become self-sufficient.
Absolutely. The thing that I learned was that whatever the circumstance, you can be happy, because actually we had a very happy childhood. And somehow my mother kept us all together, and I don't remember, you know, suffering. We were happy together. And I had lots of friends all of a sudden, because there were 10 kids all of a sudden instead of just the 3 girls. At the end of the war, my mother, we then discovered that my father was dead, because frankly, all through the war, we weren't sure.
How did you manage to come to America?
We got onto this ship, and there was electric lights, and there was food, and there was, I mean, it was like going to heaven, okay?
What was your impression of America?
I thought we'd reach heaven. I mean, through various friends, I went to good private schools, and then I went to Abbott Academy, which is now parts of Phillips Academy, great school.
You were president of your class there, age 13?
Right. In class had, I don't know, 20 of us or something like that. But, and then I went to Wellesley College, all on scholarship. Why would they have done that for me? You could say, you know, I wasn't a citizen, I was a foreigner. Therefore, I always have felt, you know, I owe a great deal to this country.
How did you choose advertising?
I didn't.
You didn't?
No, absolutely not. You know, I grew up this idealistic, idealistic young woman out of Wellesley College. I mean, anything commercial, just selling your soul, okay? No, absolutely. I just assumed I'm going to go out and do work. The only problem is that when I got ready to go to work, nobody was particularly interested in me, okay? And so I wrote 100 letters. And I must tell you, I was, you know, embarrassingly stupid, okay, naive. I wrote these letters, and then I do this interview, and they say, oh, yes, young lady, you have a lovely record, you did very well, great school you went to. And so what do you want to do? I said, well, I'd like to make a contribution to the world. I'd like to make the world a better place. And I'd like to be part of what makes the world go around. You know, well, understandably, I didn't get any offers. So finally, a Wellesley classmate of my sister's worked for something called market research. Never heard of market research, okay. So out of desperation, I went to go see her. But it turned out it was very interesting because it was about understanding the way people think. And actually, when we started, it was more about what people do. How many people blow their nose so many times, and how many tissues do they use at a time, etc., things like that. But we started to look more about the way people think. Did they like it? Did they not like it? What would they wish it was more so or less so, or whatever it is? And it was a time when the advertising industry was changing from kind of the old school tie. You know, you gave your business to your roommate at prep school or college and that kind of business, to where people had real problems in selling in the marketplace, and they'd be looking for a company that could really help them. And through research, we would be able to discover what really needed to be done and how they should change their products and things like that. So that was how gray advertising advanced itself.
What were you looking for when you went after people's attitudes?
Well, you know how today it's very common when, you know, there's polling about presidential candidates.
Focus groups.
Focus groups. Well, that's what we were doing about products.
But before anybody else had done it.
That's exactly right. And so that became a really compelling advantage that we had. And we had this chance suddenly to work, you know, for the Ford Motor Company. And they had a product called Pinto, which is the first small car. And the way that they advertised and presented to the world was this little frisky little colt kind of, you know, dancing around. They said, oh, this car is going to be fun to drive, and this is the new Pinto. Well, the car was very unsuccessful. And so they came to talk to us, and then we did research. And what we found out is that while the auto people might have thought this was a cute, fun little car, to the person who was going to buy the car at that price range, which I remember was $2,995, they were looking for, this was going to be their own mode of transportation, reliable, fuel economic, so they could afford it, take them to and from work and to all the important things they had to do. And so we completely changed the position from being this toy fun thing to a campaign that said, when you get back to basics, you get back to Ford. And repositioned this as a serious but high-quality small car. And it became an enormous success, sold ultimately over 1 million vehicles. So, but that was the big turning point, and that was how we actually discovered, by going to the customer, finding out, well, how did they view it, not how did the expert view it.
Were you recognized for your work at Gray?
I think so. I got to be #1. But that's an interesting story. When I went into business, I didn't go in feeling, oh, I bet I'm going to be discriminated against. Except one day, I got a telephone call from one of the officers at Gray, one of the vice presidents. He said, Shirley, he said, I just recommended you to be the agency's representative at some association. And he said, and I told them that if you weren't a woman, you'd be the head of the department. But when he said that to me on the phone, I was stunned. And he meant it as a compliment to me, okay? So then I decided, well, I guess I guess there is discrimination. I guess I better leave pretty soon. So I did leave for a while. And about a year and a half later, he called me to have lunch. He said, Shirley, he says, I hate to say this. It's taken us a long time to understand this, but we've decided you'd be the best head of the department. So I came back as the head of the department.
General Motors brought you over to a top position there to sell more cars, and what else?
To help understand the consumer better. There was a tremendous amount of criticism of the company at the time. They were not oriented towards what does the market want. First of all, they didn't believe. They didn't believe in research. People who would present research about a product clinic that showed that people didn't like this new model, nobody would believe it. They'd get very upset with the person who was presenting the results. So this was a whole period, fortunately now past, where the company was convinced. It was kind of like the days of, I guess, in fashion Dior, I will tell them what length the ladies' skirts should be, okay, and they will wear them. Well, I will tell them what they're going to want in their car, and they will like it. They may not like it now, but they will when it comes out, okay? I know.
Here we are at a period of global warming, and there's the battle going on over emissions and all of this, and everyone's concerned about the environment. What do you think is the future of the automobile 100 years from now when we will not be around?
I think General Motors and all the major car companies really understand that, you talk about sustainable success, okay, means if you want to be successful, you can't ignore these problems. Environment is critical. Fuel efficiency is critical. Reducing emissions and all these harmful things are critical. You may not feel the effect this moment, but if you want a sustainable success, you must address them. So they have huge resources going on this, okay. But interestingly, take just China. When we went into China, China was not particularly environmentally concerned at the time. They have become much more so now, but they weren't particularly concerned. So they just wanted to get this auto industry going, When General Motors went in, it did take its best knowledge and say, environmental protection for your workers when they're spraying paint. You got to put in the expensive, all those kinds of things that are necessary. Emissions from the plant, you got to do that. The Chinese were not requiring it, but we said as a company, we got to do that. What is going to happen is that in kind of top-down command and control markets, which are not totally free markets yet, which China is not, it's much easier to say all buses will have to be alternative fuels. Actually, China will be able to implement it a lot easier than America can. We're a much more free market. You put it on the market, nobody wants to buy it, what do you do, okay? But over there, they can just say it's the rule, and everybody does it, so.
Well, here all these years later, you are an important factor in bridging both of your countries, China and the
Right,
United
so I
States.
really feel very grateful that I was able to do it. It really was going back to that stupid thing that I said when I was 20 years old, saying, gee, I hope that I can, with my efforts, make a little difference in this world.
Great story. Thank you, Shirley.
Well, I've enjoyed having a chance to do this.
Few people had heard of David Ho in the mid-90s. That changed overnight when the young medical researcher made a stunning discovery. He found that HIV, the virus that causes AIDS, reproduced ferociously in the very early period of infection, not in the late stages as had been thought. Not only did Dr. Ho quantify that explosive growth, he and his team came up with what's known as the combination therapy, a drug cocktail that corners the virus and slows the mutation. The therapy opened a new front in the battle against a worldwide epidemic, and David Ho became Time Magazine's Man of the Year. I spoke with David Ho recently and asked him how he first met up with AIDS.
Well, I had finished my medical school and was in the process of finishing up my training in internal medicine in Los Angeles in 1980-81, and I had taken on an extra year to be the chief medical resident. And it was during that period when a few gay men were coming into the hospital with a multitude of infections. And these are not usual infections in the sense that these are infections that are only seen in immunocompromised individuals. And yet these previously healthy young men were coming down with the same, suggesting that the immune system was destroyed by something. Of course, we did not know by what. And that was a great mystery. And for me, I just jumped on that because it fascinated me. It was clear to me then, even as a young physician, that we were facing something new.
What research were you conducting at the moment, and what was your particular discovery?
I think our biggest contribution to the field, the one that I feel most proud about, is the fact that we show the world what HIV is doing in the body of an infected person. The other thing is the ramification of this discovery. We could actually quantify how fast the virus replicates and to what level. And knowing that every time HIV replicates, it makes mistakes, it makes mutations. The strategy to go with is to corner the virus, to force the virus to make multiple mutations, to evade multiple drugs at a given time. And when you crunch the numbers, you realize it becomes increasingly difficult for HIV to do so if you put on 3 or 4 drugs at the same time. And in fact, we then took this implication and tested in patients. And by mid-1996, we had a bunch of patients whose virus were controlled to an undetectable level using such a strategy.
Tell me something about the extent of the epidemic of HIV that the world is facing in the 21st century.
Well, cumulatively, HIV has already infected over 60 million individuals worldwide, killing approximately 20 plus million and leaving about 42 million living with viral infection. This epidemic is still spreading at an alarming rate, both in U.S. and more significantly in developing countries throughout the world.
Is there any hope for a continent like Africa where it appears to be ravaging out of control?
There's hope that we ultimately could come up with a vaccine to halt the spread of this infection in sub-Saharan Africa, but that's not an easy task and it's some years away. So for the foreseeable future, there's no question Africa will be devastated by this epidemic, and perhaps a whole generation could be lost to the epidemic.
Is it a stretch to say that this is comparable to the Black Plague that swept across Europe?
I think there's no doubt that HIV epidemic is the plague of our millennium. And projections suggest that over the coming decade, in India and China, we could have perhaps 40 million infections by 2010.
Give me a sense of the research you're doing right now. What are you working on?
The major project that I'm focused on is to develop HIV vaccine. That we've been working to and be able to take it back and have it be useful to the Chinese government.
When did you... Your father...
brother. until and after you
learn English students in school.
It was a struggle. And then all of a sudden I couldn't communicate, and therefore was generally viewed by others as someone who's not very good, or the dummy in the class. Particularly, kids could be cruel at times. So that me and gradually came back.
Tell me your Chinese name and what it means.
And it means one, and so simply put, it's the big one. But he chose the name because it means the great one. Now, relatives, I thought, they told me that my father chose that name because he was afraid I wouldn't be.
Face was there on the cover of Time magazine.
Well, it's probably the greatest thing since sliced bread, and apparently I feel that way about any accomplishment by one of my kids.
I'd like to. He's fulfilled my expectations.
Well, I'm sure he said that to Crown Express, who would hug you and kiss you, but the typical stern father figure. But you could tell, there was a great deal of joy in his heart at that crucial moment.
David Ho.
Thank you.
I'm Bill Moyers. The story about the Chinese in America. And I started thinking about it 30 years ago when I met some young Cisco. Then over the years, I interviewed scores of other Chinese Americans, poets, scientists, artists, entrepreneurs, and on assignment in China, I discovered how our two countries are connected through personal ties that have survived politics and war. I came to see what 65 played out over The young men and women on this bus have come from California. They're looking American story.
I feel that I've never really explored everything there is to know about my family, and I feel the best way for me to understand like what they probably have gone through. And they close. They don't go into. Part of it is that the past was very painful.
Small town America. There's puncture. To
view a Chinese family, they're in a room just doing whatever they were doing. I suppose it would be like somebody saying, well, you can watch an American family. You'd walk into a room and see them looking at a TV set or making themselves a cheese.
And drape them in splendid silks. Barnum's China was a romance from Marco Polo, filled with sages and scholars, courtesans,
Americans.
but they told of a modern Sodom and Gomorrah, a vile and wicked place.
Who knows what goes on in the Chinese opium den? Everything is mysterious.
These were push for the It began as a trickle in the 1830s and 40s. They disembarked from trading ships, one or two at a time, and without fanfare, joined the crowded saloons and tenements of New York's Lower Broadway. They were sailors, actors, petty tradesmen. And on one ship, along with the cargo of tea, 3 students bound for a Connecticut church.
I remember the first Sabbath. We 3 boys sat in the pastor's pew in full view of the whole congregation. We were the focus of the whole church. I doubt whether much attention was paid to the sermon that day.
Young Wing, with his 2 friends, was being groomed as a missionary. His stay in America was supposed to be brief. But then he didn't want to leave. He became instead a local celebrity. Young Wing, Yale, class of 1854.
Young Wing had a very positive experience at Yale. He enjoyed the company of his fellow students. His fellow students appeared to enjoy his company as well. If you look at his yearbook from his graduation, many of them write in the book saying that they appreciated him, that they learned a lot about China from him.
Could a man with yellow skin become American? The law was unclear. When Young went for his citizenship, nobody stopped him. These were the easy days. Soon he and his countrymen would be actors in a savage drama that moved from the mining towns of the far west to the halls of Congress and the White House. Young couldn't know the full meaning of his words when he told his mother that America was preparing him for great things. Toisan County, Guangdong. It's near here that Young Wing and most of the early Chinese immigrants were born. In America, they would be hounded by suspicions that their only true attachments lay here, that they could never be loyal to the United States. Certainly their roots in Guangdong ran deep. Their ancestors had reclaimed the marshes of the Pearl River Delta, and the young men were raised to work its quilt of canals and fields. It took catastrophe to drive them out.
There was the greatest flood they had yet experienced that destroyed villages. We have missionary reports talking about bodies floating in the water, whole villages destroyed. There was a civil war going on. One estimate being 30 million people were killed.
Civil war, flood, famine drove thousands of young men to the ports.
It was so bad that they had sort of a consensus agreement that they would send half their men out of the whole Taisan area in the hopes, or like a gamble, that at least a percentage of them will do well and send money back to rescue that whole region.
We know the Confucian ethic tells us that a young man is supposed to stay close to home when he's an adult to take care of his parents. But in this particular situation, in order to support parents and family, you had to leave home. Very unusual in China. They left home seasonally, and where did they go? They went to the seaports.
Long before they would come to America, the young men of Guangdong traveled widely through the South China Sea and the Pacific. But whatever their destination, their obligation to their village was paramount. It was the reason they'd left, and it shaped their life overseas. When young Americans like Christine Wong come here today for the first time, the power of these ancestral villages is still evident. The ties are so close. Her family name is shared by everyone here.
It's just like so overwhelming, like all these people and then everyone in the village comes out. I just learned at my mother's village on the 24th to generation Fong, which I couldn't even imagine 24 generations ago what life was like.
In southern China, the villages are usually clustered by family names. So if you go to a Wang village, everybody will be all Wangs there. Or a Ma village, there'll be all Ma's. So that's one indication that they're all related in one way or another.
Family, clan, village. Here the words are all but synonymous. If it's true today, it was much more so 2 centuries ago. The understanding between a family and the men who were sent away was concrete, practical, and rigidly enforced.
It was considered very important that the young men marry before they left the village as an added pressure to make sure that they would always, number one, return money to the village because now they had a wife and perhaps children in the village, but also that they would eventually return to the village.
It wasn't just family ethic, it was spiritual law. Every immigrant knew he must be buried near his ancestors, so his spirit could join them to be cared for and honored by succeeding generations. 150 years ago, these villages in southern China were charged with astonishing news. News that would put the ancient bonds of home and clan to their greatest test. It's said that a merchant named Chun Ming was the first Chinese to hear about the gold found near Sutter's Mill. His letter from California to a villager back home was the secret that couldn't be kept. That, anyhow, is the story, folded now into Chinese myth.
The people in China named America after the gold rush. You know, somewhere out there is the gold mountain, but it fit the old stories, the mythic stories. Like it fit that somewhere there were 7 cities of gold.
When there was news of gold, who would know first? Port of Canton, with the news was spread. And these people are accustomed to dealing with the foreigners. They're not terrified or horrified at the idea of going thousands of miles to someplace else in seek of new opportunities and adventure.
I think that my great-grandfather felt that he would sacrifice maybe 10 years of his life. And that was, you know, it's amazing to say, you know, I'll see you in 10 years, but they knew that it was a big journey. It was a big sacrifice of their lives to go to America. But he would eventually come back, maybe as a middle-aged man, maybe as an old man, but he would return.
And the plan would be that they would come back heroes, Gold Mountain heroes, and there would be money and food and status forever.
We were 2 full months or more on our way. Our baggage consisted of a roll of bedding and a bamboo basket. Into this we put our shoes, hat, and all our worldly possessions.
As an older man, long settled in America, we can look back.
For days there would be no wind. The sails and ropes would hang lifeless from the masts, and the ship would drift idly. Fresh water was scarce. One morning, my cousin was suddenly taken sick with fever, and we woke up to find him gasping for breath. He passed out that afternoon, and his body was quietly lowered into its watery grave. Years later, we heard that his ghost went back to his old village.
I think they came really sort of dropped psychologically into the void. And in that sense, their experience resembled the Puritans, the Pilgrims who came to Cape Cod in the 1620s and found Cape Cod a howling wilderness because they had left Leiden behind. And I think the individual Chinese had left the complexities of their own culture behind and were going into very uncertain, uncharted territory.
These mountains were a magnet for the boldest, greediest, most desperate men from all over. Canada, Mexico, China, the American South. The gold mines of California were not yet part of America, barely even part of civilized life.
You could be murdered for your shoes on a dirt road in the hinterlands in the middle of the night. You could be sleeping in your tent and a group of miners might come and decide that they're going to burn down your tent and take your gold dust. There was no law to speak of. So there was great danger, but there was great opportunity.
Crowds of Chinamen were bound for the diggings under gigantic basket hats, each man with a bamboo laid across his shoulder. Chinese baskets and boxes, immense boots, and a variety of Chinese fixings which no one but a Chinaman could tell the use of, all speaking at once, gabbling and chattering their horrid jargon.
他们自己当然是因为都是一个 group. They of course cling together in groups, like cans of sardines shipped from China. 中国被 ship 过来，这么瘦小。They were bony and small, with their queues, such a distinct look. They sensed that there would be danger and that they must stick together.
So their groups held together in the way of an older and more cohesive culture, as opposed to the Anglo-American groups, which tended to break apart. The Chinese, many of them came out of irrigation, farming, working with wood, with water, with land movement, etc. And those skills were immediately applicable to gold mining.
Teams of Chinese took over claims the whites had abandoned and slowly, methodically sifted through the silt. Many were rewarded with gold. And in the confusion of languages and skin colors on the frontier, the first Chinese managed, most of them, to stay out of harm's way.
When the Chinese first came to San Francisco, they were welcomed, open arms. Mayor Geary stood and welcomed them publicly from a platform and said, we welcome celestial men of commerce to our city, and we welcome all those who come after you.
My grandfather Yang's uncle went back to his village in China with all these wonderful stories of adventures in America, told about gold dust, and he talked about a city that was lit by a gaslight, and Chinese operas, and new little restaurants that were being built on Dopant Gai. My grandfather Young was so excited. He was 11 years old. He wanted to hear those stories because in the village, nothing had changed for thousands of years. And he begged his parents to allow him to come to America.
The Chinese pushed their way to California, a second wave of more than 20,000, just as the easy gold was vanishing from the riverbeds. They banded together and, like other immigrants, formed groups that reflected their home districts, villages, and clans. Called wigwams, these associations ordered and organized early immigrant life. They were there at the dock when Hui Kin's ship pulled in.
In those days, there were no immigration laws. People came and went freely. Somebody had brought large wagons for us. Out of the general babel, they called out in our local dialect and, like sheep recognizing the voice only, we blindly followed. So strange and so exciting that my memory is just a big blur.
The early immigrants, like my great-grandfather,
He was brought to some crowded tenement where he would stay with a group of people, and right away they would have to be put to work.
With jobs and money, the Chinese were able to import pieces of their life from back home. Just 4 years after the discovery of gold, a Chinese opera troupe was touring the mining towns.
The Chinese had their theater, and their performances were quite unintelligible to outside barbarians.
With their culture, they also brought old animosities from home. Hapua versus Zayup, Zayup versus Yenhua. Deep divisions by region, dialect, clan. Fights broke out, making for lurid copy in the white press.
So in 1852, with almost 20,000 Chinese in California, they went from being welcomed by Mayor Geary as the celestial men of commerce to suddenly a horde. You know, the horde of Chinese coming to invade California.
In the 1850s, California passed its first anti-Chinese laws, including a special tax aimed just at them. Then, in 1854, the state set a white murderer free because the witnesses against him were Chinese. California's highest judge provided the following history lesson.
When Columbus first landed upon the shores of this continent, he gave the islanders the name of Indian. This has been used to designate not alone the North American Indian, but the whole of the Mongolian race. The countries washed by the Chinese waters were named the Indies, even admitting
the judge's mangling of geography and history had a purpose: to fix the uncertain place of the Chinese in America, to link them with Native Americans and blacks as legal outcasts, unable to testify against whites.
The direct effect was that anti-Chinese violence increased. If the Chinese could not testify, then the whites would not have to worry. They'd be free to kill and rob Chinese at will. So this was a dreadful decision.
Monday, July 30th, 1855. Went up the river to Hess's, hunted Chinamen. Done pretty well. Collected about 80 licenses. I was sorry to have to stab the poor fellow, but the law makes it necessary to collect the tax, and that's where I get my profit.
California's leaders were quick to sense the public mood. Divided on so many issues, they agreed on this: the Chinese must stop coming. In the 1850s, Leland Stanford, businessman and politician, was launching a career that would help change the face of the American West. He would shift back and forth in his views of the Chinese, his volatility a mirror of the country's. Stanford had made his way to California looking for a quick fortune, and made one in hardware. Then, restless, he ran for governor.
Asia, with her numberless millions, sends to our shores the dregs of her population. I shall concur with any constitutional action having for its object the repression of the immigration of the Asian...
He was sounding the alarm that, we have to keep those Chinese under control because they pose a serious threat to our culture and our civilization and our well-being. We cannot allow the Chinese to come in here and overrun us.
Under assault, the Huiguan leaders set aside their rivalries to form a united group, the Chinese Six Companies. In the long journey of becoming American, one of the first steps was to become Chinese.
To these people at that time, there's no such concept. The basic idea is I'm from Guangdong, I'm from the Pearl River Delta, and you're a Hokkien, he's a Hakka, or something like. They know who's who, and they speak different languages. They don't understand, mutually unintelligible. But once you're treated as Chinese, then they are Chinese.
The California mines had become treacherous places for the Chinese. They were learning. To compete head-to-head with whites was to risk one's life.
So basically, they were already kind of afraid. So whatever they encountered, they just endured with all their might. If I endured this, maybe it will pass. And I try to keep a low profile, make myself low-key, as if I didn't exist, only doing their work, never daring to cause trouble.
Whites had given them a generic name. John Chinaman they'd be called, at work or on the street. They knew better than to argue, and they had more pressing concerns. Their families were counting on them.
They're pushed into other occupations, starting a garden to grow fresh vegetables, and then realizing that you could also sell these vegetables to non-Chinese. Chinese labor was brought in to clear land. They began the process of digging irrigation ditches and channels to drain the water out. They become fishermen. They notice immediately the abundance of sea life in the coastline. Shellfish, squids, octopus, all kinds of things which are delicacies in China, which by and large European Americans ignore. They would begin drying it, salting it, sending it back to China. There are no women here, and men are willing to pay money for somebody who can cook food or clothes. Men would begin crude restaurants, making a huge batch of what we call chow, stir-fried vegetables and meat. You stepped up to a place, usually outdoors, and somebody came along, gave you a mound of rice, put chow on top of it, and this was a quick and fast way for people to fill themselves.
Triangular yellow flags began appearing in San Francisco, the sign for a Chinese restaurant. A place to get abalone and shrimp, tamarind and ginger. The Chinese carry off the prize, marveled one travel writer. They anticipate your wants and secure your patronage.
This was the kind of work that a China man could get at that time. They did women's work. A lot of them were nannies, and restaurant, cooking, and they did the laundry.
In the woman-poor West, there was one sure supply of jobs, domestic help. It was work white men wouldn't take, so the openings were plentiful for new arrivals like Wee Kin.
I think it was the only work that my great-great-grandfather could sort of find as a Chinese immigrant. And I think there were a lot of other Chinese immigrants who were doing this sort of domestic work.
It's very common for upper-class Californians not just to have Chinese on their staffs, but to have Chinese living with them, becoming really part of the family, albeit in a feudal relationship of servant and master, master and retainer, nevertheless a close, intimate relationship.
In his old village, Wee Kin had been a farm boy, he and his father and the livestock all sleeping in the same room. Only 15 and still wearing his queue, the traditional Chinese pigtail, Wee Kin found himself in a new world.
The Gardners had a big house on Telegraph Avenue and 20th Street with a beautiful lawn and big shady trees. Mrs. Gardner taught me to read and write, and I learned much also by listening in when she gave lessons to her children. It was here that my American education began.
I think that relationship is very profound between upper-class Californians who could bring the Chinese into their families. It works as a kind of underground current against the anti-Chinese agitation that's going on in the larger society. It's a assimilation, literally through nurture, through family life. It's assimilation of two races to each other. but it's in truncated form, unacknowledged, subliminal.
They had found shelter, steady wages, even some human affection, but at a high price. Over time, the image of the Chinese as servants, slave-like and submissive, would come back to haunt them.
The more that Chinese went into that profession, the more that visual image was embedded in the American mind. The stereotype began to grow and to be reconfirmed and reconfirmed over and over.
稍后请收看《台湾百年人物志》。